Join us by the fireside for our evening tales of true life's strange experiences with things that lie beyond the veil of the known and into the misty depths of the mysterious and unknown. The Old House in New England. Hi, my name's Diane, and I want to share a story with you. It happened maybe about a year and a half ago when my daughter and I went on vacation to a place in New England. We stayed at an old colonial house and we rented it for a month. And this, I did this upon the recommendation of my daughter Amy because I'd had a really rough time in my marriage. Before I was divorced. I was with an abusive partner, and he used to physically and emotionally abuse me to the point where my self-esteem and my self-worth really started to go downhill. And my health suffered, and I was just generally having a very hard time just living day to day. And so Amy was kind of my savior. She's always been one of these really wise kids. I mean, it's like she just knows what people need. And she's only 13 years old, but she just is really helpful. It's like she's my personal therapist or something, And anyway, Amy knew perfectly well what I'd been through, and she was just very strong throughout, her childhood, growing up in an abusive household, where she had to watch her father being abusive to her mother and so on. And, but she always stayed pretty balanced, and I'm actually the one who suffered the most. So anyway, Amy decided to recommend that we go on vacation. And she said, Mom, just rent a house or something and we can just get away now that you're divorced and, and Dad doesn't have any hold over you anymore. Let's just get out of here and go and rent a place and stay somewhere for a month, somewhere old and like an old romantic house or something like that in New England. So I just went online and I checked out all the places available. And, there were a load of really nice, romantic looking, historic houses that you could rent, and I thought, well, okay, this would be a really good idea. And we actually decided on a beautiful colonial house set in a few acres of woodland in New Hampshire. So that was like about a month away, so we got all our stuff ready and we're both really excited, and the house just looked perfect, and I just had this idea that we're just going to go there and I would just relax and read books and just stay off the internet and take time off work just to recover and try and come up with a plan for my life and just to develop my self-worth again and bring back my health and my energy and so on. So anyway, the month went by and we got on our flight to New Hampshire and we were just so excited. And it took us a few hours, but we eventually got a taxi and we arrived at the old house. And it was really quite something. I mean, it just took my breath away. As soon as the cab arrived and parked outside the front door in the driveway, I just got out and I looked around and I got this weird feeling. It was like this place was somehow familiar to me, like I'd been there before, which of course I hadn't, It was just a really odd feeling. I looked around and, I paid the driver and he went off and just left us both there, and I just kind of had to stand there for a moment and just look at the house, and, it was a very strange feeling. And it was surrounded by old trees, and but it had quite big windows, it had quite a lot of windows too. And so anyway, I just sort of brushed that aside, I thought, wow, it's just one of these weird things that just happen, with no explanation. So we had our key and we went in, and we were just met with this beautiful kind of historic looking house with all this antique furniture, and it's almost like stepping back in time, and it was like you just, nothing had been changed. since the 1800s. So anyway, we kind of walked into the living room, and we looked around, and we're just sort of admiring all this beautiful artwork. Everything looked like it was original, from 17 to 1800s. And so we were just in awe as we kind of explored the house, and it was a nice sunny day, and it just felt really kind of cozy, and it was just perfect. And Amy just said how much she loved it, and she said, "Mom, this is your time now for healing, for resting, for just kind of your therapy, for letting go of the past and just thinking about yourself, writing down some goals and things for yourself and for your life, and and all this kind of stuff." So we were just very happy to be there, and we went upstairs and we looked at the rooms, and there were like 3 bedrooms, and the master bedroom was really nice and big, and Amy wanted her own room, so her room was perfect for her because she liked talking to her friends, on her tablet. So everything just seemed really perfect. And so we unpacked our things, and we started to just make ourselves comfortable. We brought some food with us, and the kitchen was absolutely lovely. It had everything we needed. It had all the right utensils and just everything that you need to make yourself a nice meal, and it was so homely. So anyway, a few hours passed, and we just kind of settled ourselves down for the evening in the living room, and we were just kind of enjoying the fire because we had a wood-burning stove, and we just had some firewood there as well, stacked up against the side of the house in a sort of little shed. And so we made a nice fire, and we were just sitting there really cozy. And I had some nice romance novels, some sort of period stories that I really wanted to read, but I never really had time, in my busy schedule at home. So each of us just quietly went into our own little world, me into my book, and Amy into her phone, and chatting with her friends on the phone. And so the evening passed away uneventfully, but very peacefully, and I felt really happy there. So anyway, the night kind of drew in, and closed the curtains. There were these big kind of thick velvet curtains and these tall windows, and we just kind of closed them up and felt really nice and warm in there. So we eventually went to bed, and I slept really deeply. There was just no noise. It was so quiet outside. And the house, too, was just very, very quiet and peaceful. There were no neighbors around. There was just woods all over the place. Just the whole house was surrounded by woods. And so we decided the next day in the morning to go for a nice walk. We made breakfast, and we kind of headed out and went for a nice walk. So we walked for about half an hour. There was this trail that led from the back of the house and up through the woodland. And we just kind of explored and had a great time together, just talking about the past and about the future and our plans, and trying to be positive as well, not dwell too much on the negative things in life. So we walked on, and somewhere in the distance we saw a shed. It looked like a shed or kind of an abandoned little house or something. So we grew closer to it, and it just had this sudden weird feeling as we drew closer. It looked like it was partly dilapidated. There were windows, 2 little windows, and they were sort of partly broken, and some of it had been vandalized or something, or maybe it just fell. Some parts of it fell because of the weather. So we were kind of hesitant to approach it. I mean, Amy felt a little bit weird about getting close to it. She had a really bad feeling. I should say too that she's actually very intuitive, and she just kind of gets feelings about places and people, and they're always right. She's always right. And if she has a bad feeling about someone, well, sooner or later we find out that she was right. There was a good reason for her feelings. So I decided to listen to her wisdom, because she suggested that we don't go in it. There was a door, and it was kind of partly open, but we just didn't want to go in. So we walked past it quickly, and I don't know why, but I just had this very kind of scared sort of feeling that came over me. It was a sort of weird anxiety. I even noticed that my heart was beating a little bit faster than normal. So we kind of walked past it, and we walked a little ways further on, but nothing felt right again after that. Even though we walked quite a ways past it, it just didn't feel right. So we decided to walk back towards, the house that we were renting. But we didn't want to walk past the cabin again, or shed or whatever it was. So we kind of went on another trail that sort of went around. We weren't sure if it was going to head back that way, but it looked like it did. So we just kind of went a little bit of a circle around that area. And we eventually did arrive back at the house we were renting. So I wasn't sure why Amy had such a bad feeling about that place and why I didn't feel very comfortable there either. I just, kind of let it go and forgot about it. I mean, there are just places that you just get these feelings at, and there isn't necessarily an explanation for it. It's just one of those things. So we just let that go, and we went home and we just made ourselves some lunch, and we just kind of settled down and chatted for a while and just had a really nice afternoon. We even sat out on the porch because it has one of these old porches, that you can sit outside, and it's all open, and it was just a lovely day. So we did that and sat there for a while. I did kind of wonder about the history of the house. We hadn't really looked into it, so we didn't really know much about it. Maybe something had happened there, some historical significant thing, but we just didn't know. So once again, we had a very nice evening, and we kind of repeated the previous day's events, for the evening, of just sitting around and just reading and chatting a little bit and sitting by the fire and just really enjoying our time together. And eventually we both went to bed, each to our own rooms. And this time, as I was about to close the curtains in my room, I noticed there was almost a full moon. I think it was probably about 2 or 3 days before the actual full moon. So there was quite a lot of light coming into the room, and I hadn't turned on the light yet. I was going to just go and reach over to my bedside table lamp and turn that on instead of the main light because, I just wanted to keep that cozy kind of feeling and not have too many bright lights on. So, but before I did that, I just kind of happened to look out of the window and just noticed the moon. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be lovely to just leave the curtains open and just kind of just sit here for a while and just look at the moon and just relax, So I turned an old velvet covered chair around towards the window, and I just decided to sit there for a few minutes and just kind of contemplate my life, how I felt about myself, to be honest, because like I said, I'd had some problems with self-esteem, and I knew that I needed to do something. I needed to take charge of my life and take control of my feelings and my thoughts about myself and so on. So I just sat there thinking about these things. And all of a sudden, I sat there for maybe like 15 minutes, 30 minutes, something like that. All of a sudden I heard this noise. It was like a scratching. And I thought, well, it's probably an animal or maybe, there's a tree branch outside scratching against one of the windows. But then I remember there weren't any actual trees that close to the actual house, that the branches could reach in and scratch the windows or the walls or anything and make a noise. So, I just kind of sat there. I wasn't alarmed or anything. Most of the time these things are just animals or just something that can be explained easily. But then I wondered, maybe there were rats in the house, maybe there were squirrels up in the attic or something, who knows? So I just continued sitting there for a while, and I just kind of listened, and this time it was like my senses were kind of honed in, just really listening in to see if I could hear it again. It was like I was just curious, that's all. I wasn't afraid, just curious. So another 5 minutes passed as me sitting there and just looking up at the moon and thinking that maybe, I should just turn the light on now and then just close the curtains, take a nice shower and then head to bed and read a book for a few minutes, and then just kind of go to sleep. So I was just about to get up. All of a sudden I heard the noise again. This time it was louder, and it was a definite scratch. But it was kind of a scratch against the window or something, but I couldn't see anything. I looked. I couldn't see anything. So, I was kind of puzzled, and I decided to get up and try to look outside through the window. I had this feeling not to open the window. I know that maybe I should have done just to see what it was, but I just had this feeling not to open the window. It's like something inside me just said, don't do it. So I didn't. I kind of listened to that, because I'd learned from Amy a long time ago that if you get these feelings like this, these nudges, listen to them, because they always have some kind of meaning to them. There's wisdom to them. So, I kind of stepped back. I moved the chair back to its original position, and I stepped back from the window, and I thought, well, I'll just kind of stand here for another moment and see if I hear it again. And I just stood there for a while. All of a sudden, there was this ear-piercing scream, and it was the most terrifying thing I've ever heard in my life. And the reason it was so terrifying is that it sounded like Amy. And for a moment, I just kind of stood there, and I didn't know what to do. I was so scared and so much in shock that I actually couldn't move, and I couldn't speak, but I wanted to call out to her. So after about 4 or 5 seconds, I suddenly just managed to break the spell that was holding me there like that. And I called out her name, and I just screamed out her name. Amy! Amy! What is it? And there was nothing. So finally I just rushed out of the door, and I ran to her room. And she wasn't there. And her room was dark. And all of a sudden, it was like my heart was just thumping in my head. And I couldn't think clearly. I just couldn't think clearly. I couldn't move. And I was just frozen. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Where was she? Where could she have gone? There was no sign of her things. Her phone wasn't on the bed. Because for a moment I wondered if maybe she was in the bathroom. But it was dark in the bathroom. She has a bathroom in her room, and it was dark, and the door was open, and there were no lights on. So I was now, by this point, in panic mode. I rushed through the house. I ran downstairs calling her name. Amy! Amy, where are you? Amy! And I just ran from room to room. I just opened every door and just ran in. And there was no sign of her. And I looked outside. I went outside, and I couldn't see her anywhere. So I thought, well, she must be in the house somewhere. I mean, where else would she go? So with my heart just thumping, and at that point, I honestly thought I was going to faint. I was so panicking, and my heart was beating so fast that I thought I was going to faint. And at some stage, I actually felt nauseous as well. So I rushed back upstairs, and I thought, well, I'll go and look out her window. Maybe she's outside. I don't know why I thought that. It didn't make any sense. But anyway, at the moment, at that time, I wasn't thinking clearly. And I just rushed back upstairs, and I looked out the window. All of a sudden, something really, I can't explain this, but something so strange happened and so terrifying. As I was running towards the window in her room, I suddenly stopped in my tracks, because suddenly she was there, looking at me through the window. But she was outside. I couldn't quite see her eyes. It was too dark. But I could see her silhouette and kind of a little bit of her lower face, her mouth, and her upper body. I couldn't see her lower body because she was outside, looking in through the window. And so I stopped for a moment because I was kind of a little bit frozen by this vision of her. And I didn't know what to do, because although I thought it was her, at the same time, something about it made me stop, something about the way she was standing there. And I felt she was looking in, but as I approached, I could see that her eyes were kind of facing down. Her eyelids were half closed or something. It was like she was looking down. And she was wearing a white, like a night dress or something, and which was kind of odd because as far as I could remember, she didn't have anything like that. She just wore PJs. So I stood there for about 3 seconds just staring. And suddenly I just said, "Amy! Amy, what are you doing?" And she didn't look up. She kept looking down. And it suddenly occurred to me, how could this be Amy? How could she be standing there looking in through the window, since this is an upper level room? There's no way she could be standing there. But then I thought, well, maybe there's some kind of ledge or something. Maybe she's sleepwalking and she's managed to get out the window and she's standing on the ledge looking in. And when I thought that, I instantly panicked because I became terrified that she might be sleepwalking. And if she was, there was a chance she would fall down. And if she fell, she could seriously injure herself or even kill herself. So I quickly rushed to the window. And suddenly she spoke. I could hear her through the glass. She said, "Mom, let me in. Open the window." So I rushed and I grabbed the 2 latches on the windows, ready to pull it up because it was one of those old-fashioned windows that you have to kind of lift up to open. And as I grabbed the latches, I looked at her face, and suddenly she looked at me, and her eyes were pitch black. And for a moment, I just screamed. Involuntarily, I screamed. It's like I lost control. And I released my hands from the latch as if I had received an electric shock or something. And I just kind of fell back and I crawled back on the floor with my eyes still staring at this image that was supposed to be my daughter. But I knew without a doubt that was not my little girl. That was something else pretending to be my little girl. So in a state of terror, I crawled back, falling and stumbling. It was like my legs were so weak that I could no longer stand. And I just went against the wall. I just kind of went into a corner of the room, still staring at the window and at the silhouette out there, asking for me to open the window and let her in, or let it in. And I just was huddled there, crying and crying. And I started to call on God, and I started to call on my mom who had died years ago. I called on her. I asked her for help. I said, Mommy, please, Mommy, help me, Mommy. And I just didn't know what to do, and I was just there huddled in the corner. And eventually, I started to say the Lord's Prayer, which I remembered from when I was a kid, and I used to go to church with my parents. And I hadn't been to church in all that time because I wasn't a religious person anymore. But I remembered it, and I started to say it over and over again. And I just said whatever came to my mind, mantras and all kinds of things I had heard that are protective against evil spirits. And eventually I found the strength to get up, and I just rushed out of the door with my legs still shaking and weak. I managed to get out, and I ran downstairs, and I didn't know where I was going, but I was calling Amy. I was calling her and calling her. And I looked outside from one of the downstairs windows that was practically just below the room where I had seen the apparition that looked like my daughter. And I had this feeling to just rush out of the front door because I couldn't see anything through the window. And I rushed out of the front door. And I went around, and I don't know how I found the courage to do that, but I did. And I walked around the house, and I looked at that window where I had seen the apparition, and it wasn't there anymore. Now, I don't know what happened to me at that stage, but it was like something else took over inside me, a strange kind of inner strength that just came over me and kind of made it so that I felt like I was in control of myself. So I started to walk back towards the house, still calling Amy. And all of a sudden, I heard her voice. She was crying out for me. but it was coming from inside the house. So I rushed back in, I slammed the door shut and locked it. And I just rushed upstairs because I figured that's where it was coming from, and I was calling her and calling her. And she started calling me. I could hear her, and it was coming from her room. "Mom! Mom! I'm up here!" So I rushed up the stairs. I went to her room, and I was in this panic mode. My heart was beating like crazy because I didn't know what I was going to find. I didn't know if it was going to be her or if it was this thing I saw. Maybe it had gotten into the house. Maybe it had done away with my daughter, my Amy, and it had taken over her body. I don't know. All kinds of wild, crazy, terrifying things were rushing through my head as I opened her door. But there she was. She was sitting on her bed and she was crying, and I knew without a doubt that this was my little girl. This was Amy. This wasn't some cold apparition. This was her, a warm-blooded, living Amy. And suddenly a wave of relief just washed over me. And I just started crying, and I rushed towards her and I hugged her on the bed, and I just cried and cried, and she cried in my arms. And it was like we didn't even want to talk about it for a while. We just wanted to hold each other. I was so grateful. I can't even begin to express my gratitude at seeing my daughter right there in her room, fine. And it was a while later, after we cried together for some time, that we were able to actually speak. And I asked her what had happened. And it was then she told me the strangest, most terrifying story. She told me that she had been sitting in her room right after I had gone to bed as well. And it was probably maybe 15 minutes after, maybe 20 minutes. And she was just talking to her friends on the phone, just texting, as usual. And then all of a sudden her lights went out. Her phone went dead. And she heard this noise at her window. And she saw this apparition or something just begin to manifest at her window, because she had opened her curtains by now to see where this was coming from, because she knew it was coming from outside. And for a moment she just kind of apparently stood there looking at this, and she couldn't tell who it was. But she felt really, really scared, and she said that at that stage she was paralyzed. She couldn't even scream. She couldn't call out to me. She wanted so much to call out to me, but she couldn't. It was like she was mute with fear, like sort of frozen on the spot. And as she stared at the window, in the moonlight, this apparition began to appear. And she said, it was me. I was out there. And she was just staring at me, wondering what I was doing out there. She thought maybe I had fallen asleep, and I was sleepwalking, and there was some kind of ledge up there, and I was walking, and for some reason I was there at her window. She said those were her first thoughts, but she also felt so scared, and she wondered why would she feel so terrified at seeing me, even if I was sleepwalking. Something didn't feel right. So she kept staring at this thing, and she couldn't quite see the eyes because the eyes were kind of downcast. So she managed to get closer. She was very apprehensive because she felt really kind of scared, because she knew something was very, very wrong with this. It was like it wasn't really me or something, but she wasn't sure. So she went closer to the window, and this apparition looked up, and she saw the same thing that I had seen. The solid black eyes, cold, like so cold, like completely devoid of life and feeling. So for those moments she just stumbled back, and she couldn't speak, she couldn't cry out, she couldn't run out of her room. And for a while she was just there, just paralyzed with fear. And eventually she said that this thing started speaking, and it was asking her the same thing. It was asking her to open the window, that it was her mom. Open the window. It's your mom. Open the window. Let me in. But fortunately, she ignored it. And eventually she managed to find the strength to move, and she tried to open the door of her room, but she couldn't. She just couldn't. And then she was there for a minute with this thing asking her repeatedly to let it in, to open the window. And then at some point she crawled under the bed because she was so scared. And this is something she used to do when she was a little girl, by the way, when she became nervous or afraid, like when her father was abusing me. She would go and she would hide under the bed. So she hid under the bed and she just stayed there. She stayed there, wrapped up in a ball, just kind of hiding her eyes. And it must have been at that point that I had gone into the room, but for whatever reason, she didn't hear me, even though I was calling her name. And it must have been at that point that I went into the room. But for some reason, she said she was just too scared to come out, because she thought this thing had come into the house and she just couldn't come out from under the bed. So she just lay there without speaking. And at that point, I left the room, and that must have been when I went outside the house to look for her. So after she told me this story, we both just hugged each other again, and we just sat there for a long time without speaking. Now, we didn't know what that was all about, but we had absolutely no intention of staying in that house one more night. So we contacted the agency that we had rented the house from, and we told them the situation, and that we'd had a strange, unexplained experience in that house, and that we were no longer comfortable staying there another night. And the lady we were talking to, she kind of went quiet for a while, and then she said something. She said that she had to admit that we were not the first people who had had an unexplained experience in that house, and who, for that reason, had also decided to leave. So she said that if we wanted to know more about the house, about its history and so on, we could go and see her at the office, and she would be happy to discuss it with us. So Amy and I talked about it for a while, and we thought, wow, this is kind of odd, something must have really happened here at some point. We wondered why they hadn't disclosed that to us. Because, if something significant had happened there, you would have thought that they would have said something beforehand. So anyway, the next day we decided to hire a cab, and we went over into town to see her, to speak to her. She took us into her office, and she introduced herself, and she was a really nice lady, quite down to earth and cheerful kind of person. But she became really quite serious and kind of sullen and almost scared when she realized that we were the people who had been staying at that house. And she told us to sit down, and she asked us if we wanted tea or coffee or something, and she began to tell us about the history of the house. Now, she said that at some stage back in the 1800s, the house had been owned by a wealthy merchant, and he lived in the house with his family, his wife, and 4 or 5 kids. And at some point, everybody was happy and everything, and, it was a happy, successful family, and everything seemed to be going well for them, and there were servants there, so it was always a busy, happy house. Until one day, when the husband went away, since he was a merchant, he often traveled. He went away, and nobody knew where he went. He just said he had to go away, and he had some business to attend to. And he was gone for about 3 months with no communication to the family, no letters, nothing. Nobody knew where he was, where he had gone. But they said, apparently, when he came back, he was different. He had once been such a mild-mannered, cheerful, kind, wonderful man, and suddenly, when he came home, after 3 months, he had changed to the complete opposite. And nobody knew why. Nobody knew what had happened to him or what he had experienced. Nothing. There were rumors from other people who knew him, and somehow they knew something that the family didn't. And they said that he had gotten involved with some black magic or something in a far-off land somewhere, but nobody really knew what this was all about. So suffice it to say that he changed, and when he came back, he ended up murdering his whole family. And this became big news back then, and of course, it was something that traumatized the whole community for a long, long time. And so we heard this and we were just astounded. Amy and I just kind of looked at each other open-mouthed, and we said to the lady, well, why didn't you disclose this to us? Why didn't you tell us? I mean, there's obviously something still there, some really dark, evil presences there, after something like that happened. And she just said, well, the house just goes up for rent, and we're not obliged to let people know all its history. It's up to each individual to just have their experience, and there have been a lot of people who stayed there and nothing happened to them. So but she says that occasionally people do complain, and people do say that they can't stay there. There's just something there, some evil presence, and they cannot stay there. So that was it. I don't know what else to say about it. I'm not going to reveal the exact location of the place, but I will say that this changed me forever, this experience. That shock, that trauma stayed with me. And even today, I sometimes see that apparition in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat. Amy has moved on, though. She's very strong, and she helps me to deal with some of this, this trauma that comes up as well. So let's hope that sometime in the future, if we go and stay somewhere again, that it's not going to be a haunted house. Thank you for listening to my story.